all here this morning to CSIS, both all of you who are here for the program in person and for the hundreds and perhaps more who are watching online from outside of Washington and overseas. My name is Michael Matera. I'm the director of the Americas program here at CSIS. Venezuela is in a crisis that is the most dramatic that we've seen in the Americas in many decades. History is being played out before our eyes, and an important part of this history is promoting public debate and interchange. This is where CSIS and other institutions like our own are doing our work in presenting a balanced view of history as it plays out. The Venezuelan people are living through critical times that will determine the future of their country. The international community also has a very important role to play. OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro has been playing a very proactive and responsible role in this regard. Stronger action by the international community in recent months has been held back by indecision and doubts, but it appears that this is finally changing. Now more than ever, Venezuela needs the support of the international community. Beyond the current crisis, our Americas team at CSIS is also studying closely the many tasks and reforms that the country will need to undertake to put its political, economic, and social structure back in order. We are committed to helping as much as we can in this post-crisis process. We welcome the involvement of many of you in this work. I want to turn the floor over now to Moises Rendon, our Associate Director in the Americas program, who is leading our efforts on the Venezuela project. Moises has been working tirelessly over the past year in educating us on Venezuela, organizing numerous presentations and roundtables, and bringing together dispersed efforts here in DC and beyond. We're all very proud of the work that Moises has been doing. Moises, the floor is yours to introduce and to moderate the first part of our program this morning, which is a discussion with Maria Corina Machado in Caracas. Moises?
Thank you so much, Michael. Welcome, everybody. We're glad to host such a crucial and timing topic today as the Constituent Assembly issue in Venezuela. Starting from the referendum last Sunday, these next 2 weeks are going to be crucial for the future of Venezuela. Every single decision that we seen in the next hours by domestic actors, but also international actors, is gonna determine the course of the future of the country. So we're really glad that you're here with us on this important discussion. To discuss this issue, we're gonna have one of the most thoughtful experts on the topic, starting with Maria Corina. With no further comments, we will start with a presentation via video conference from Caracas. Maria Corina just mentioned that someone turned off the internet on her neighborhood, so she has to move to a different house. And so we're happy that you joined us, Maria Corina, and you troubleshoot in such a short time. We're really glad that you're here with us. Maria Corina is the head of the political party Vente Venezuela, a former congressman and one of the most important leaders and figures in Venezuela. Maria Corina stands out not only because of her courage to fight Venezuela's democracy and rule of law, but because of her dedication to community service. Maria Corina was a founder of Atenea Foundation and Oportunitas organization nonprofits that help children in need. Maria Corina also was co-founder of Sumate, one of the main nonprofits that oversees free and transparent elections in Venezuela and also defend political rights and human rights in Venezuela. Maria Corina has also been a professor at Andrés Bello Catholic University, my alma mater, by the way, and she's a thoughtful and brave leader. Depending on time, I will have the privilege to ask Maria Corina 1 or 2 questions to follow up on her remarks. We then will wrap up the conversation with Maria Corina, and then we'll invite our experts to join the stage and start a conversation regarding the Constituent Assembly issue in Venezuela. Maria Corina, we are aware that today there is a national strike in Venezuela. The country as a whole is supposed to stop. There's people are staying at their houses from 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. tomorrow. So we're really glad that you were able to join us, Maria Corina. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much again, and please, the floor is yours. Well, thank you very much, you all, Moises, CSIS, and I'm honored to share with such remarkable guests that will speak to all of you today as well. You have to add that it was an heroic trip to come from my house to where I'm right now, because, as you said, Venezuela is in a national stoppage today, and there are barricades throughout the country, and it's very difficult to move through the city. I would start recognizing that we've lived 111 days of civil uprising that turned into an unstoppable popular movement, a true popular rebellion that's taking place throughout Venezuela as we speak. And when this protest cycle started 111 days ago, Venezuela was at the threshold of freedom. After last Sunday, July 16, we have crossed this threshold. We have crossed this line. And I believe that we are cautiously taking steps in a last phase of this struggle and this fight to bring down the dictatorship and to move ahead in a transition to democracy and peace, which will be stable and sustainable. Everybody knows around the world that the institutional and economic collapse in Venezuela, what we're seeing is a result of a small ruling group that has run out of options and has used fear, violence, and fraud to remain in power at any cost. And we've known for some time that the dictatorial nature of Maduro regime and the criminal nature of his fanatical entourage. What we never probably realized was the strength and the commitment of the Venezuelan people to bring down the most perverse and dangerous regime that has set place in our hemisphere and in our history. I'll start just with a few remarks on where are we standing today. Where is Venezuela today? It's well documented the degree of the humanitarian crisis that has been evolving and how it's getting worse every day that goes by. I just want to insist in one element, one indicator. The fact that the minimum wage in Venezuela today is $1.3 a day, and just to survive, a family needs over $5 a day. So it is just these two figures give us an idea of the degree of the humanitarian catastrophe that is evolving in Venezuela. On the other hand, I would like to insist in the internal security crisis that has gone out of the hands of the state security forces. The criminal gangs that were armed and organized by the regime now have taken over wide bases of cities and rural states in which the state can no longer exercise sovereignty. Third, a mafia system that has penetrated not only the government and the regime control powers, public powers, but that has been penetrating every single sector of society, the financial system, the media, industrial activities, armed forces, certainly, and even political parties. So this is a mafia state, a mafia system that has been penetrating societies and certainly are willing to maintain the status quo. On the other hand, I have to mention systematic and massive violations to human rights and how the number of political prisoners has been increasing in the last days, torture, censorship, and so on. But as I said before, and this is where I will like to make the most emphatic point, is that throughout 18 years, the Venezuelan society has resisted the advance of a totalitarian regime that has used every single method to annihilate our libertarian ideals, and that has had support from international forces and interests, because of cruel indifference in some cases, and because of unconfessable interests, and on the other hand. So how we got here, how this crisis started its detonation. Well, we've seen in the last years, and specifically in the last months, how the regime has been blocking every single institutional route. After the National Assembly was elected at the end of 2015, overcoming all obstacles and fraud, the regime ordered immediately that all its capabilities were taken away, and the next step was, as we all know, closing the route of the recall referendum. So we started this year with a realization that there was no institutional means through which the regime would allow reforms that would meant serious change in the quality of life and freedom and democracy for our country. In February, when these two rulings from the Supreme Court formally annihilated the parliament, this was certainly a tipping point that made all society realize that our only option left in order to regain democracy and freedom was to exercise our rights, constitutional rights, which is public uprising, and those are supported, as we all know, in Articles 333 and 350 of the Venezuelan Constitution. And that's how it all started. I'm not going to describe the intensity and of these protests, because they're all very well reported, fortunately, thanks to the international media and the social media. But I do want to insist in its characterization as a popular rebellion, and at least because of four of its characteristics, conditions. One, it's a nationwide movement, not as other times before, in which we saw Los Andes particularly active, or the center of the country. This time is every single region in Venezuela. Second, because it's all sectors are involved. Certainly are the young students that are in front line have turned into an emblematic element of this fight, but you see their grandparents, their small brothers and sisters as well in the streets. Third, I was in the second element was regarding the generational scopes. Third, it's all the sectors that are involved nowadays. It's not only the students, it's workers, and we might have a chance to talk about the general strike that has been announced recently for next week. But you see the academy, you see the production and private sector, you see NGOs, human rights activists, you're seeing all Venezuelan society united in struggle. And finally, something that has been portrayed in the past as a weakness of our protest, which used to say that this was a middle-class movement. Now you can see behind a small or something to defend themselves as a young kid that comes from La Bombilla in Petare, a very poor household, sharing its fights arm with a young student that was abroad in the States, and without their parents knowing that he was coming back to Venezuela to fight, they shared this fight in the streets. So I insist in this because this movement is unstoppable. It has to do with hunger, true hunger of food, of medicines, but it does have to do with values and hunger for dignity and freedom. And that's what makes it so powerful. And that's why when Maduro decided to answer, because the government, the regime realized what was taking place in April, they decided to move ahead with brutal repression and with the initiative of the Constituent Assembly. The reaction of Venezuelan society was not what they expected to move back, but on the contrary, to elevate and increase the degree of the strength and the pressure in our fights, and that brought as well decisions and actions that are good elements to believe that this time we are truly moving ahead in a transition to democracy. And I'm referring to the reactions of three pillars that have been sustaining the regime for many years. One is the international community, and we've seen now positions from governments across the world, and specifically in this hemisphere, that are clearly stating that it's not only a dictatorship, but a regime that needs to move out. Second, defections in individuals that have been loyal for 20 years, first to Chavez and now to Maduro. The most remarkable certainly is the Attorney General Luis Ortega Diaz. But there are many others, and information that is leaking, people who are moving back from what their positions used to be. And third, we will certainly need to talk, probably we can do that further ahead, about the position in the armed forces. And in that sense, I would have to say that one of the results, or two of the results of this absurd call for a constitutional assembly, is one, that all the democratic forces in the country have come tighter together, and second, that the fractures and divisions in what used to be this thought monolithic support to the regime is now more than evident. So now I would like to give a few reflections on what the plebiscite meant, and what it mandates from now on. At the beginning, it wasn't clear for the Venezuelan society, specifically those who are in the vanguard, in front line, what we were looking with the call of a plebiscite. Some thought that it was, we run the risk of reducing the pressure on the streets. But it was obvious that its objective was quite the contrary. It is remarkable what Venezuelan society was able to do in less than 3 weeks. I have been involved, as probably some of you know, in other citizens' movements and organization and participational processes, such as those in 2003, 2004, and so on, where tens of thousands of volunteers get involved. But believe me, this was way beyond what we've seen before. And we knew the risks of accepting this challenge, but we understood that it was something we really needed to do. It had nothing to do with counting ourselves. It's obvious that we are a white minority, and today over 90% of Venezuelans want an urgent regime change. It had to do with legitimacy. It had to do with getting together and committing each other with this last and most critical phase of fight against the regime. And we overcame all kind of objectives. We have no money, we had no security, of course, no electoral council. And that was one of the good and marvelous achievements to prove that we don't need this kind of official support in order to make this huge participation process take place. We had no armed forces, no Plan República, and but what we did have was censorship and threats. We had only 2,030 sites where people could sign and vote, and and what we saw, I have to say that I used to be always the most optimistic one in the room in terms of what our goals are. And I never, ever thought we were going to see this degree of participation. More than 7.6 million Venezuelan citizens in one day throughout the world. What we saw worldwide in 96 countries and over 700,000 Venezuelans go out simultaneously throughout the world with their co-citizens down here, and at the same time exercise the most impressive and big, massive act of civil disobedience in the history of humankind is something that changes our history and our future. And I believe Venezuela on Monday 17 woke up to another reality. And the regime knows it. And that's why we've seen these last reactions of more repression and aggression. So moving ahead, what is in front of us? This exercise of the plebiscite, as I said before, takes mandates to several sectors. One is certainly to the National Assembly in terms of moving ahead in naming the new justices of the Supreme Court, which it would take place tomorrow, and move ahead in naming the rectors of the Electoral Council, which should take place next week. On the other hand, it's a mandate to the armed forces. They better understand that they should stay on the side of the Venezuelan people, which are not going to move back. And they should lower their arms and accompany transition to democracy, which cannot be postponed. And thirdly, probably the most important message is to ourselves. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing in the streets today. Venezuela is totally on stoppage at this point, and we realize this is an escalade that will day by day increase in its strength, and of course using constitutional and democratic methods, but that require as much pressure on the regime as it is needed for them to understand that time is over. So going forward, I just want to insist that this fight is not about the Constituent Assembly. Actually, we went out to the streets much before Maduro came out with this absurd proposal. This has to do with our right to live in freedom and peace. And we will not leave these streets and will not stop our pressure. And we demand the support of the international community at this point to move ahead in a transition, and that requires certainly the Maduro and his regime leaving power. So, for those that today speak about dialogue and negotiation with the regime, it's important to understand, for them to understand, and we certainly appreciate those who really are concerned about Venezuelan situation and its risks for the stability of the region, must understand that we will not accept any agreement other than moving ahead in a true transition. And that means getting rid of the mafias that have penetrated our society, the regime, and are certainly working hard to maintain the status quo. So I will end up saying that these are certainly the most dangerous days. Pain is profound, and we realize that as every hour passes, we will see repression taking other levels. We've seen that in the last days, as simultaneously on Monday after the plebiscite, hundreds of members of the civil and the armed force and the National Guard got into residences in Caricuao, La Candelaria, El Valle, El Paraíso, popular sectors of Caracas, in which the regime was most surprised and hurt to see hundreds and thousands come out the day before. And their reaction was to fire to them, to hit them, to get into their homes at midnight. What we've seen today is that those communities, far from being broken, have gotten stronger and are in the streets as we speak, decided to move ahead. So, as I say, these are the most dangerous days, the most obscure ones, but these are the final days of the dictatorship. And that will mean that Venezuela has to wake up and to rebuild together in a transition government and a unity government in which all sectors of society will be represented, in which the emergency will be taken care of starting with the first day, because those who are in the streets demanding Maduro to leave right now will be the next day demanding food and medicine. So we will have to bring solutions immediately to these very vulnerable sectors of society, but at the same time, we will start working, which is structural, and rebuilding our democratic institutions. And that will require huge trust and huge moral authority to address issues such as the role of the armed forces, what we're going to do with our oil industry, how can we open to the global investment and technologies, and how we will bring back trust and hope for those who have left and are deeply needed in our country will come back. And how that will happen very, very soon. We be sustainable, and in order for we can move ahead and be able to leave a legacy to the new generations, which is this would have been the last tyranny to set its foot on Venezuelan soil. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria Corina, for your thoughtful presentation. I think our audience here really felt the powerful of your words. And I think we're all impressed of the outcome of the referendum. This is a clear mandate, like you mentioned. This is 98% of the voters have a clear mandate. So I think the international community, and I'm glad of that, is watching closely more than ever. We have world leaders announcing a lot of strong statements. Now, Maria Corina, we don't have, unfortunately, too much time, but I will really like to ask you one question. This is a key question for all of us here in Washington and the international community, and I would just like to get your thoughts on it. And we understand that resolving the crisis ultimately needs to be a Venezuelan-led effort, no? The current crisis and to rebuild Venezuela ultimately needs to be a Venezuelan-led effort by domestic Venezuelans. But what do you think the United States and the international community role should be on the current crisis, given the current circumstances? How can we, the international community from abroad, can help right now in Venezuela, not only today, but also for that rebuilding Venezuela transition that you're talking about? If you can walk us through that process, will be very helpful.
Well, first I would say, Moises, it's certainly a Venezuelan-led process, but what's taking place in Venezuela is not only a fight of the Venezuelan people to a ruling, corrupt group of Venezuelan individuals. There are very complex and very dangerous international interests that are taking place, that have set their foot and their operations in our country. Drug cartels, mafia, and so on. So it is not true at this point that there is not an international intervention in Venezuela. The FARC, the Colombian guerrillas, and the narco-traffic network. So it is Venezuelan dramatic situation has to do with us, certainly, because every day that Maduro stays in power, there are at least 80 Venezuelans that die because of the dramatic situation. But the evolving crisis of Venezuela has direct implications for the whole region and for the security of the whole region, because a mafia state, a narco state, is in place in our country right now. So it is a problem for the region, and I would say for global institutions. Second, there is many actions that would demand for many years, and that if they had happened before, I believe we wouldn't have reached this point. Having said that, today we've seen that the United States has stated individual sanctions to over 20 individuals, civil and military. And that has had a direct results, not only in those that have committed those crimes, but many that have been supported under the regime that have not committed those kind of crimes and have decided to break away from the regime because of that information coming out. So what I would demand from the international community is not only for these individual sanctions to take place, because they work, but also to explain that these are not individuals that are isolated, but it's a whole structure, a criminal structure that has taken place and control of our country, and that is the reason why they have to go, and they have to go now. So I believe that international pressure is needed more than ever. I know there is pressure to support the regime from those criminal groups. So we need the international democratic community putting more than that level of pressure for Maduro to understand that his best option or his only option is to accept to step aside and give him certainly warranties and terms to facilitate this process. But what is absolutely unacceptable is a trade in which Venezuela has to accept a mafia state that is killing our kids and our children and our young people that are protesting in the streets because an international transaction is being accepted. That is certainly unacceptable, and Venezuelan society will not tolerate. So to answer directly your position, your question, I appreciate and I'm grateful for those countries that had recognized what happened with the plebiscite on Sunday. 12 different countries recognize it. 16 have alerted Maduro not to move ahead with the Constituent Assembly. And what I expect is that all these forces come together with the institutional offensive that's taking place these days in the National Assembly and the Attorney General, and certainly with the popular movement that will not stop but increase in the days to come.
Thank you, Maria Corina. I think you had a great point. International community should act and should act soon and should increase the pressure. I think is the right approach. Maria Corina, unfortunately, we don't have much time left, but this has been a great discussion. It's important that to recognize your leadership in Venezuela. Thank you so much. We hope next time we can host you in person here in Washington, and we hope that happens sooner rather than later. Thank you so much, Maria Corina. You're more than welcome to join us online with other participants on our website. But thank you again. Thank you for being here with us, and we're watching closely. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mokesi. Falta poco. Falta poco. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, I would like to introduce Mark Schneider. He's going to moderate the conversation with our experts. Most of you know Mark. He's a distinguished and thoughtful expert. You all have his bio on a bio packet, but Mark has a great experience on many policy issues, including post-conflict reconstruction, national building. He's a senior advisor here at CSIS. He served as a senior vice president and senior advisor at an international crisis group until recently. He has testified frequently before Congress on conflict issues. In government, he served as the director of Peace Corps and also as assistant administrator of USAID. We're honored to have you here, Mark, to join us on this important and crucial topic of Venezuela. Thank you, and please bring the expert with you to the stage.
The next panel really is going to continue this effort to underscore the magnitude and explain the nature of the crisis in Venezuela, which I think it's important to emphasize today constitutes the gravest threat to the rule of law, peace, and security in the Americas. State-sponsored violence is there every hour on social media. The Maduro minority government, now down somewhere to below 15% in the latest survey, has been willing to violate provisions of the Chavez Constitution that require separation of powers, an independent judiciary, due process of law, and a representative legislature. Our distinguished panel will explore the latest and most serious step, establishing a Constituent Assembly without popular approval and with unlimited powers from three perspectives. The first presentation will focus on a legal perspective, both with reference to the Venezuelan Constitution and inherent constitutional norms in a democracy. Dr. Gustavo Tare, a distinguished Venezuelan lawyer and constitutional law professor at the University Central de Venezuela for 27 years, will provide that perspective. Dr. Tare also taught political science for 25 years at the Universidad Simón Bolívar and served as a member of the Venezuelan Congress from 1979 to 1999. He chaired various committees and also was deputy chief of the COPE of the Christian Democratic Bloc in the Congress. Then we'll hear an analysis of the strategies and options for the political opposition to the regime with respect to the Constituent Assembly. Armando Briquet, who's a former campaign manager for the Venezuelan presidential candidate Enrique Capriles Olonsky in 2012 and chief strategist for him when he ran against Maduro in 2013. Will provide that perspective. Armando also has a wealth of campaign strategizing experience at local, regional, and national levels in Venezuela and around the region. And finally, we'll hear whether there's a new potential for unified international action with respect to the Venezuelan crisis following Sunday's plebiscite, where, as you've heard, more than 7 million Venezuelans came out against an imposed Constituent Assembly. Some 20 different governments and organizations now from around the world have criticized that proposal and called for the Maduro government to back off. There's no better person to assess whether the Constituent Assembly is a game changer internationally than Mark Fierstein. He's the former senior director and special assistant to the president for Western Hemisphere Affairs under President Obama. He also held significant positions at USAID, including my old post as AA for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Deputy Administrator. Mark currently is a CSIS Senior Associate and Senior Advisor at Albright Stonebridge, a commercial diplomacy firm, and a consultant to communications and polling firms and to Major League Baseball. He will analyze the likelihood of sufficient international pressure being mounted now to generate a change in policy by the Maduro government, which in turn might lead to a different scenario than the current descent into chaos that we face. Each panelist will make a brief statement, and then we'll open it for questions and answers. We'll begin with Dr. Tati.
Thank you very much, Mark. Voy a hablar en español.
I will speak English. The first overhead that we have indicates that this calling to the Constituent Assembly is the culmination, or the continuation or culmination perhaps, of the destruction, institutional destruction. In a country where we used to have rule of law, as you call it in English, the rule of law, it has all disappeared. Starting with the parliamentary elections of 2015, this brought about the elimination of all the activities and the competencies of the National Assembly. No sanctioned law has been able to come into vigor. All the possibilities, all these opportunities have disappeared, violating the Constitution completely. This took place ever since this government took place. In 2016, they should have elected governors, and they didn't have it. In 2017, they should have election of mayors and the municipal councils, and we haven't had them. The main leaders of the opposition, including Maria Corina Machado and other important leaders, are forbidden to run as candidates. The registry of different political parties has been denied. Any dialogue, even the Holy See, any type of dialogue, the Holy See that has posts, etc., they have been rejected, including the Attorney General of the country. So this has made us have a calling for this modalities, for three modalities. Two modalities to modify the Constitution are similar to the ones that exist in the United States. The possibility to amend the Constitution. This is done through the Assembly. And then this requires the approval via referendum. These are mechanisms that are included in the Constitution and that use the existing powers. In the United States, you all know that the Congress can have that initiative to reform the Constitution, which has to be ratified by the parliaments of the different states. So those two modalities, to reform or to make changes that are not essential in Venezuela, they're clearly defined, but there's a door that is open and that don't exist in many regimes in the world. Maybe the only one that exists is in Venezuela, and that is that if you want the woman to change the state radically, change the judicial order, and to redo a new constitution. So that's when you call for a Constituent Assembly. So there are three questions that I would like to propose and answer in this presentation. Number one, why is there a call for a Constituent Assembly? Number two, who could make this call? And number three, how do you make elections for that Constituent Assembly? And the first question is, what for? This is the judicial text, but you can see it. But the most important thing is that power and the sovereignty resides with the people. The original constituent power is with the people, and it can only be done by the Venezuelan people. So the possibility to change the constitution radically can only take place through the authorization of the Venezuelan people. This is how Hugo Chavez did it in 1999. A referendum took place, and the Venezuelan people agreed to have a Constituent Assembly. So it's been proposed to call for a Constituent Assembly, like I said before, is to draft a new constitution. And ever since it was approved in 1999, all sectors linked to Chavismo have sustained that this was the best constitution in the world. And a constitution that was supposed to last for about 1,000 years. Now, the government says that the idea is not to change the constitution, the idea is to improve it and to deepen it. But for that, you don't need a Constituent Assembly. And they also said that this will improve it will eradicate inflation, and it will improve economy, etc. But there's a second intention, which is the real intention of the government, and that is that once the sovereign people, will, with a whole of quotes that you have to add, quote unquote, once they elect this Constituent Assembly, they have all the power. They could definitely get rid of any mayors, etc. They have not established how long it's going to last. And the election mechanism that are being established take us to the fact that this current government of Nicolás Maduro will have complete reign for the unforeseen future. This time frame is not really established. And this absolute power is what Nicolás Maduro wants. Who, according to this constitution, can call for this Constituent Assembly? We said that in the year 1999, President Hugo Chavez called for a referendum that used this Constituent Assembly. And after Article 347, like you said, the next article establishes that the initiative for calling a National Constituent Assembly, that referendum, that popular consultation is in the hands of the president of the municipal councils or the collecting of signatures, in which 15% of the electors can have. So he omitted that step for the reason is that referendum would have been lost by him, and we will talk about that a little bit later. So why is Maduro interested in this? Why? A president that has very low support calls for an election. Well, because the election is decided in such a way, so the government will win it no matter what. When you call for a Constituent Assembly, you have to establish how you vote, what electoral system you will use, who could be candidates, etc. Who establishes the norms? The Constitution doesn't have them. They have general principles in which it is established that the sovereignty of the people is expressed through the universal vote, direct and secret, etc. Everybody has the right to vote, and everybody can do it in such a way so they don't know what their intention was. And they have direct elections, without an intermediary or a middleman. So the rules in order to elect that Constituent Assembly has to be done through a referendum. That's how Hugo Chavez did in 1999. In this opportunity, it didn't happen. Maduro decided that he would establish the rules, and those rules are very sui generis. They are very linked to the political situation in the country. In this overhead, you can see that 90.5% of people think that the situation is very bad, and about 9% of the population see it as good. This could show you how people would vote if Maduro allowed it. But this is from April of 2017. It's a bit old, and I dare say this has changed quite a bit. If you ask people if there were elections, 70.5% would vote for the candidate of that position, and 7.2% would vote for the Chavismo candidate. So Chavismo is divided. The opposition has grown. This is always in the mind of Nicolás Maduro when he calls for this Constituent Assembly. A normal election, like it should happen in any country in the world, of representatives, would be lost for sure in a greater proportion. So what was chosen? Every municipality would elect one member of this assembly. There are about 340 municipalities. Each one elects one, and those with the capitals, where they have capitals, they elect two, and then they would have that direct vote. So why do we elect one per municipality? The reason is very simple. The municipalities have very different populations. For example, the municipality of Marua in the state of Amazonas has 1,800 inhabitants. The municipality of Sucre in the state of Miranda has 750,000 inhabitants. With this electoral system, both of them elect one of this Constituent Assembly. So one vote is worth 400 more. It's worth 400 more votes. Now, Sucre, which is the biggest state, which has 750,000 inhabitants, since it has 2 municipalities, it elects 2. And the Trujillo state has 625,000, elects 21 representatives. And the state of Zulia votes are worth 5 times less than Trujillo. It's such a ridiculous mechanism. For example, Texas has many municipalities or counties, and they should have more representatives than the state of California because the number of the counties in Texas are greater. So that is a mechanism that is designed in order to win that part of the elections, because now we will see that the elections has 2 parts. I said that it could be, but looking at the situation that Venezuela is living through, possibly even in this situation, the government would also lose the elections. Because in the rural areas, which are the smallest areas where Chavismo was very strong, they were not strong anymore, or it is not strong anymore. So in that case, the opposition could overcome the government. Now, we could add that to these 300 some congressmen or representatives elected by the municipalities, we will elect 173 sectorial representatives, which represent the workers, the field workers, the fishermen, and the different communes and communal councils. So we can ask ourselves, why these sectors and not others? Why, for example, housewives don't vote, or teachers or informal workers? I don't know. It's a rather capricious election, but it has a very important characteristic. What is the electoral registry? How do you know who's a student, who is a field worker, or etc.? You don't ask for those lists. You don't ask the universities for those lists. The government decides who are the agricultural workers. They decide who the fishermen are, etc. So it's the government who makes those lists. For example, I went into the National Council, Electoral Council. I looked at the webpage, and I'm not in the other categories. It could have considered me as a worker or as a person receiving a pension, etc. I put my wife's name in there, and she's not in there. So they choose it however they want, and those 173 representatives are supporting government. So the government cannot lose the election, even if they lose the popular vote by the majority of 80-20, like we saw it in Zulia. If we see how the Venezuelan people has reacted, we're talking about last month, what would people like to see? What would the Venezuelan people like to see for the solution of their problems? Well, to wait for the elections at the end of the period that it would be December of 2018, 11%. A general election will show about 46.2%. What the government is proposing, 6.6% for a constituent assembly. A government of national unity, which does not exclude the former 20%, or an exit, is 14%. What is important is that only 6% of the Venezuelan people think that the Constituent Assembly is the solution, and that is reduced to the capital. Everybody wants a different solution to what the government is proposing. Now, the intention of Maduro is not to solve the social and economic crisis. His intention is to remain in power without having free elections. Because we're not only talking about the governor elections that should have taken place, or the elections of mayors or municipal councils that should have happened this year. We're talking about presidential elections of 2018. There's no perspective at all that the president could win. So that's why there will not be a democratic election with this government. What they're looking for is the creation of mechanism in which the government cannot lose. That is the scheme of the Constituent Assembly. That's what I wanted to talk about, regarding the judicial situation in Venezuela. Thank you, Sorga. Sorry, I'm speaking Spanish. What's happening in Venezuela is a lot deeper than my English, so I am going to try to express myself this way. To talk about the opposition, it's impossible not to dedicate a second to the government, because the opposition is the counterpart to the government that we have in place right now. In Venezuela, we have a government that is not democratic, like Maria Corina said, is governed by the mafia, and that has great implications in the drug trafficking and different businesses that are involved in Venezuela and in the region. And definitely do not want to turn over power. Now, starting in the year 2006, we wanted to have an electoral majority. What does that mean, electoral? It wasn't enough for the surveys to say that we were a majority, but it was proposed for this to be represented in the majority election. For a vote to be counted in Venezuela as a vote, in the case of the opposition, it requires basically 2 to 3, or the effort is multiplied by 2 to 3 times. So in the case of the government, with half a will, they turn that into a vote. They pressure government workers, even if they don't like exactly what they are living, but they end up voting for the government. So the effort that the government has to make to earn a vote is a lot smaller than the effort that the opposition has to make. So this is what we lived last Sunday. The fact that we were able to get the will of 7 million Venezuelans in 14,000 places, specific voting votes. This expresses a great electoral organization, the electoral organization that exists in Venezuela. People like Mark, who came in 2002 and 2004, in which we learned a lot about this situation. It has no comparison in the continent. It doesn't exist, and I mean the whole continent. In 15 days, to be able to organize such a process it's an electoral process that is unprecedented. Now, in the year 2012, with a very similar process, because they had the help of the CNE, which is the National Electoral Council, about 3 million people showed up, so about 7.5 million people could be counted. So there's great significance of what is taking place. So that was proposed, and without a doubt, we can talk with great pride of great advancement and consolidation regarding the unity of the Venezuelan people and their sense of responsibility regarding what the country is going through and their future. And as a premise, at the same time, there's a protest that has been taking place for about 100 days on the streets, and it hasn't stopped. For example, right now we have this complete stoppage, the protest. But of course, we cannot maintain the intensity, but we have the will, for sure, without a doubt. Now, what happened on Sunday, what we could see is that we don't have 7 million people who belong to the middle class. There are no 7 million people who are part of the higher class, especially given the poverty that we're facing as a country. So the government threatened with this Constituent Assembly, and it's taken its toll on the government. Like Gustavo said, is the only election the government can win in Venezuela. Of course, only if he can design it himself, and he very much violates the concept of the election itself. Yesterday, the president of CNE announced different centers. So imagine in an election where you are electing a representative per municipality. I mean, I could vote wherever I want in any municipality. So what is the validity of that? So the registry is completely open, and that is the only election that they can win. Why am I saying that this is taking its toll? Because without a doubt, what the government wanted to do is to threaten and divide the opposition, to cause that fragmentation of who would participate or who wouldn't participate, which is a legitimate discussion in a democratic society. whether they were going to participate or not. And the government was counting on the fact that the opposition would be divided and that they wouldn't go on the streets anymore. But the reaction has been completely different. What is divided now is the government itself. Why? Because the powers that Gustavo talked about, including the Constitution, and they are saying that they can omit something they can do, but they do it, the internal powers. They can also, if it's a supreme power, they could also influence the place where the government of Maduro is established. So this has generated definitely a fight, but controlled by the assembly. So that, what he's trying to do, he's trying to trip us up, but it's tripping them up. And it is helping us to show evidence of what we are living currently in Venezuela. So Maduro is definitely a prisoner of his own proposal, and this generates very low credibility and popularity. And we see the conflict. So, I don't know. We don't know if the assembly will materialize or not. But I want to insist that the most important point is that the government is looking for or needs is resources, and maybe this is where the National Assembly was diluted, and perhaps the focal point would be financing. The government could not go into debt without the authorization of the assembly. So what this Constituent Assembly is trying to do, which is really wanting to substitute that responsibility, it gives much more uncertainty in the international community. So the government, like I said, is entrapped in this assembly. Constituent Assembly. And if we had to define it, it's not to change the Constitution, but it's really thought of as a governing mechanism, and it's definitely a double-edged sword. So, like I said, I think that we're all very aware of the situation in Venezuela, and we have to be aware that time is running out. Now, I would like to highlight two things. That democracy does not take place in one day or in a moment. It's a process, and that process has things that take place before the government changes and after the government changes. So the process has that widespread scope. I have no doubt that this process has started in Venezuela. Once you have a government change, it's very different compared to the transitional period that is taking place in Venezuela. And like I said before, like an example, for example, what happened on Sunday is very much an anchor of what we are going to define next, which is that, in my opinion, we will start dialogue within Venezuelan society as to what kind of country we want to be. We know what kind of country we do not want to be, but now we have to start the dialogue as to which kind of country we want to be. And like we saw yesterday, there's that awareness, that sense of responsibility. There are many teams working on this, and it has to be a technical dialogue, and within the society to define the country and rebuild it. And we have to have access to resources due to our crisis. This is what has to happen in Venezuela in the next few years. Okay, Mark? My apologies, I'm going to speak English.
Well, I want to begin by first recognizing the efforts of my Venezuelan colleagues, and especially Maria Corina Machado and really the millions of Venezuelans who've been waging this very, very difficult and painful battle for democracy, not only for a few months, but for many, many years. And when a Venezuelan decides to protest, he or she is literally putting at risk their security, their freedom, and even their lives, as we've seen. And when you vote in a referendum in Venezuela that's not authorized by the government, you're exposing yourself to retribution as well, as we've seen in the past. So these are extraordinarily brave people, and really we really need to honor the Venezuelan people. We've heard a number of presentations about how difficult things are in Venezuela and how they're actually getting worse. And I think to date, the international reaction has been insufficient to the task. But I think there are signs that that is changing. So I want to talk a little bit about the lessons I think the United States government and other countries can learn from the last few years and offer some suggestions about next steps for the international community. I think the first lesson, fairly basic one, as we heard earlier, pressure on the regime is absolutely essential. And we saw what happened last year with the dialogue between the government and the opposition when it failed. And the government basically used it to buy time, consolidate power. And it failed because basically all forms of pressure were reduced or eliminated. The opposition chose to cease its protest. That was in deference to the Vatican and others and their request. There was minimal OAS action, if any, at the time. And for a period, there were no additional U.S. sanctions against Venezuelan officials for corruption or human rights abuses. In contrast, in the last few months, last few weeks, we've seen the pressure intensify. There have been more than 100 days of protests, somewhat greater efforts at OAS action, and we've seen stronger U.S. sanctions, including against the vice president of the country. I think those are the reasons that Leopoldo Lopez, maybe the reason Leopoldo Lopez is now at home. Of course, he's not free, but he is at home with his family, and that international pressure clearly mattered. I think a second lesson is that the government cares greatly about its international legitimacy. Now, they may say they want to leave the OAS, but the fact is they do not want to be isolated internationally. Every time there's been an effort in the OAS to pass a resolution with regard to Venezuela, the government has fought it strongly. And other fora as well, whether it's been the UN Human Rights Council or others. And we saw what happened last year when the foreign minister, Delcy Rodriguez, literally sustained injuries trying to get into a meeting of Mercosur when the organization was suspending Venezuela. I think a third lesson is that President Maduro is impossible to reason with. And frankly, when I was in the White House, we tried to identify international interlocutors who can get to him. And frankly, we were unsuccessful. And I think other leaders in the region are extraordinarily frustrated that they were not able to reach him and get through to him as well. And at times they would reach agreements and they would fall apart shortly thereafter. But related to this as a fourth lesson, it is possible to influence people around Maduro. And Maria Corina mentioned the defections that we've seen, obviously the Attorney General being the most prominent of those. But there's evidence of other, both civilian and military officials that are breaking with the regime. And clearly that is a reaction both to the domestic protests, the pressure within Venezuela, but also the sanctions from the United States as well. And I think a fifth lesson is that the United States should not be afraid to act alone in certain ways up to a point. We obviously have influence capabilities other countries simply don't have. It would be preferable to operate through the OAS. It doesn't appear that's going to happen now. The OAS lacks the votes that they need from certain Caribbean countries for whatever reason. But I think the situation is so bad now that unilateral measures that would have been rejected and were rejected 2 years ago are now accepted. When we in the Obama administration sanctioned 7 Venezuelan officials in April of 2015, the Venezuelan opposition found it necessary to distance themselves from that action. We were condemned throughout the region. And compare that to the reaction a couple months ago when the Trump administration sanctioned the vice president of the country and there was nary a protest. And obviously beyond, that's in part because the situation on the ground has gotten so much worse, but there are also new actors in the region. The changes in government in Argentina, Brazil, and Peru made a big, big difference. And we're also seeing Mexico playing a much more important diplomatic role as well. So where does that leave us now? We're obviously in a dangerous period, as we all know, we've heard. The Constituent Assembly is likely to go forward. I don't see the government reversing that decision in any way. They can't back down now. They would look as if they're caving into Trump. The opposition is going forward today with its general strike. The National Assembly will name Supreme Court members and electoral council. Meanwhile, there appear to be continued efforts at a negotiated solution. Colombia, for example, has been trying to engage Cuba. When President Santos was there, we'll see where that goes. But there does need to be an exit strategy of some sort for regime officials. And again, Maria Corina mentioned this, that there needs to be some sort of guarantees or terms for certain officials. Some sort of immunity needs to be offered. Obviously, this is a decision to be made by the opposition, and it would need to be backed by the international community. But there needs to be a place for certain leaders to go. And ideally, that would then pave the way for new elections and a democratic transition. But that said, the continued pressure is absolutely essential, or such negotiations will not succeed. And if the pressure is not going to come from the OAS or the OAS member states as a collective, that leaves you with the actions by the opposition and their mobilization and their efforts, and then the US and other countries working outside the OAS. We all saw a couple days ago President Trump's statement threatening, quote, strong and swift economic sanctions. That can mean a couple things. It can mean additional individual sanctions. Venezuela is a target-rich environment. As Maria Corina said, it's a mafia state, basically. There are plenty of officials there engaged in corruption and drug trafficking and money laundering. There are plenty who have been engaging in rights abuses and setting back democracy. So obviously there's potential people that can be sanctioned. But the statement also does suggest targeting the oil sector as well and taking measures beyond just the targeted. And my understanding is that some countries, some leaders are privately asking President Trump to act in that with regard to that sector. Now, there's been a lot of commentary about the potential for the United States to ban oil imports. That strikes me as unlikely. That would have a devastating impact on the economy. The Venezuelan people would suffer even more than they are now. It could lead to a social implosion, migrant flows into Colombia and other countries, could have domestic consequences here, including an increase in gasoline prices. Now, some people might argue that it's better to provoke a further economic collapse in the short term that might prompt regime change. Strikes me as a very dangerous option. It's highly unpredictable. It's hard to tell how this would play out. And it does bring to mind, frankly, the Pottery Barn rule. Colin Powell, what he referenced in advance of the invasion of Iraq, and basically said to President Bush, look, you break it, you own it. And we have a president now in the United States who doesn't want to own the US healthcare system, which is his responsibility. And he also wants to cut foreign aid by 30%. Does he really want to be responsible for reviving the Venezuelan economy? And I think if we did go down this route, it potentially gives Maduro an opening as well. Now, Maduro always condemns the United States and accuses us of all sorts of things we have no responsibility for. And no one believes today that the United States is responsible for the economic collapse in Venezuela. The Venezuelan people hold Maduro responsible for that. That said, if we were to go toward more drastic action against the economy overall, that potentially opens up an opportunity to blame the US. And obviously complicating the situation is that Trump is profoundly unpopular in the region and in the world. And he's a poor spokesperson of human rights, and given his own rhetoric and actions here, and is really his dismissal of the importance of human rights and freedom internationally. That said, there are a range of things that can be done under these so-called sectoral sanctions. It's possible to cut off exports of petroleum diluents, for example. You can limit certain exports of certain equipment. So it is possible to start off modest and then ratchet up. And I would hope and expect that that's the direction that the administration would go in if they choose to go beyond the targeted sanctions. One of the big questions, of course, is will other countries join in? Will the European Union finally join in with us and sanction, either do targeted sanctions or more broadly? When I was in the White House, I lobbied EU officials to try to join us in a sanctions effort. There was no appetite at the time, I think because things have gotten so bad on the ground and because of the actions that the Venezuelan government has taken. I think they're more inclined to operate now or to go in that direction. We'll see. And a lot depends as well on what Latin American countries are prepared to do. But it's clear there is a positive feedback loop between the actions that the United States and other countries take and developments within Venezuela. And the more the opposition does, and the more they take to the street, and the more the Venezuelan people are engaged, the more the international community is compelled to act. At the same time, the more the international community acts, the more the opposition feels emboldened. So hopefully we'll see more of that positive dynamic in the coming days and weeks.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to ask one question and then open it up. And the question is, because it goes to Mark's point about he doubts that there's a likelihood of anything that can be done between now and the Constituent Assembly to bring Maduro and his regime to step back. And my question is, are any of the sanctions, do you three feel that any of the sanctions have been discussed if they were threatened specifically, unless the Constituent Assembly were canceled, and a group of countries, including the United States and others, were to say, we will not recognize any government coming out of an illegitimate Constituent Assembly, which, as we've heard, is clearly illegitimate? Would that have an impact now on bringing about a decision not to move forward with the Assembly? Come on, we just start in the reverse. Start Mark and then Armando.
No, I prefer to hear my
Yo creo que es una
colleagues first.
excelente idea.
I think that's an excellent idea. It would have to come from a very significant number of countries. I don't know if it's a viable solution, but obviously an announcement from the international community that says if any Venezuelan state that would come from that Constituent Assembly will not be recognized, that would be something that would happen with very few historical precedents, but it is very important. I think it's very hard to identify which is the only variable that is working or not. I do think that the sanctions put very significant pressure within the government, on their families, etc. It should be. And I am convinced that laws exist and sanctions exist because they are necessary within society. So if the country is going through this, I think that it should have consequences at international level. I think that is very significant in any society.
That's in fact what the Trump administration did. That was the phrasing of the statement. I don't have it in front of me, but I know Moises probably has committed it to memory, so I don't know if you recall. But I thought that was basically the message, is if you go forward, we're going to take, phrasing again here, I had it written down here, the strong and swift economic sanctions. And I think it was notable that, even though, Paraguay came out, I think supported it directly, but other countries did not criticize the statement, and if anything, they followed up with their own statements critical of the Constituent Assembly. I think, PPK did in Peru, Santos, and the Vatican even issued a statement which was not critical of the United States, but critical of Venezuela. So I think that message has been sent, but I still think that the genie's out of the bottle. I think it'd be hard for them to turn it around at this point.
Please, do we have a mic? We have a mic. Okay, let's start with this young lady here on the right. We have a mic coming.
Good morning. I'm going to do my question in Spanish. So, buenos días.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Venezuelan, one of the thousands of Venezuelans that have left Venezuela seeking a better future with a hope to go back to my country, to rebuild the country. My question, I feel very optimistic with what is going on in Venezuela. I think that there are possibilities for the regime to fall and for us to rebuild our country. But at the same time, I see certain circumstances, certain conditions that have to take place for a civil war to take place in Venezuela. Do you think that that could happen in Venezuela, that the conditions are ripe? Is that a possibility? Thank you.
Middle, right here.
Lines, I'm actually also a little bit curious about what are the prospects for opening a Pandora's box by having two governments within one state, and if there are real implications in terms of the unity of the armed forces that would be, in a way, positioned to either recognize one or the other. Just to follow up on that question. Thank you.
Ruben?
Yes. Thank you. Ruben Perina from GW. What kind of a political system could emerge from the new Constituent Assembly?
Why don't we take those three? And Armando, you want to begin, and then Mark, and then Gustavo.
No quería, pero lo hago.
I didn't want to begin, but I will. The conditions for a civil war in Venezuela. I mean, there is tension and violence in the last few years. Very, very large. In all these demonstrations, you know, we have seen great reprisals and repression. I don't know if we could start a civil war because we don't have the weapons, you know, from one side and not the other. I don't know if that's within the parameters of that civil war, but it's the degree of violence is rather awful. And I have no doubt that that's part of the reason that's why you're here. You are trying to seek a better future, not due to financial reasons, but security and violence. I am not a specialist regarding the armed forces, but without a doubt, you feel that is the great support of the government. But at the same time, I watch the news, and routers, for example, not too long ago, were registered about 173 detentions in the past few days due to conspiracy. You think this process is definitely permeating within the armed forces. What is the consequence of that? I don't know. I don't know that I want a civil government and a civil solution. So they say that there is a Constituent Assembly that will not change the Constitution. So I don't know what the result of this type of government would be. Regarding the civil war, like Armando said, you have to have two armed forces. So we would have to have military uprising. So you would have to have two military, divisions. It wouldn't happen like the Spanish Civil War. We don't have all that kind of weapons. We would have to just have a blockage, and weapons would not come in and ammunition would not come in, so the war would stop. It's a great risk that we have to try to avoid. And this is why the opposition has always tried to exert that type of civil, electoral, and constitutional pressure. We are not doing anything that could have a semblance of an insurrection that would end up in a civil war. Now, the French have an expression for a great change. Oh, no, the great silence. Now, the military is usually very loyal until they rebel. So nobody can solve what's going on, like Armando said. And the officers live the same situation regarding food and medicine. They could have some privilege maybe, but they cannot overcome the disaster of the educational system and the whole infrastructure, the disaster that their families are facing. They can give them food, but for the closest family, the nuclear family, but not their extended family. Now, regarding to the political system, the government has given many versions of what will come out of this Constituent Assembly. For me, their only intention is to remain in power. Like Armando said, they're fighting amongst themselves to see who will stay. What type of state will come out? I mean, some have talked about a communal state, modeled after Russians. It's 1917 Russia, and then the others say that the Constitution will remain the same, but there is no indication that this Constituent Assembly will show us a state, which shows that their intention is to remain in power.
We spent a lot of time in the Obama administration working on contingency plans. In the event of, you described it as civil war, we called it a social implosion, but maybe it's just a nicer term. And we were prepared, for example, and are prepared to send in humanitarian assistance. And USAID is a warehouse in Miami, and they can send in food tomorrow and medicine. And if there are Venezuelan people watching this, you should know that the United States has made an offer to send in humanitarian assistance, and it can be sent in immediately. The only reason it's not going in is because the Venezuelan government won't accept it, and President Maduro even denies that there was a humanitarian crisis in the country in the first place. We also spent a fair amount of time working with the Colombian government and working with UN agencies to prepare for possible flow of migrants into Colombia. So the Colombian government is prepared for that, and various UN agencies are prepared to support them. So hopefully this will not come to pass, but I think that this planning does need to take place, and the international community does need to be able to mobilize the resources if it happens.
Other questions in the back?
Good morning, Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst. One question about the international community. Venezuela still has some allies in the international community. You mentioned Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia. I think like some months ago, some Venezuelan troops went to the Bolivian anti-imperialist school that Morales founded over there. On the international level, you have even, the global level, you even have Russia that has Rosneft, that has Gazprom involved in Venezuela. To what extent do you think it's going to be a future of this Venezuelan, of Maduro's allies at the international level? How much can they take before they realize enough is enough, we can't keep supporting this government? Thank you.
Other question? Two right here.
Primero, ¿qué va a hacer la...
First of all, what is the opposition going to do regarding the vote for this Constituent Assembly? Are they going to boycott it? Are they going to win it? Are they going to support it? What are they going to do? And let's say that there are elections and the opposition won and Maduro would leave the country. What could you expect after that? I mean, this country is so in debt, and they have Chavista cells on the streets, and perhaps some of the people remaining would have this criminal record. Could be a transitional model for the military, for the government members, or members of the government. How could you improve the situation with a country that is so corrupt? I'm Venezuelan, and I'm going to ask a question in Spanish. My question is very simple. If the government is willing to do it all, to remain in power, in a narco state, in a mafia state, how can we define it as a state? How far is the government willing to go? And how can you negotiate the fact that it is not good for the government to do whatever it takes to remain in power? Regarding the international support and countries that have expressed sympathy toward the government, there are some changes that are rather significant. One would be, for example, Ecuador has abstained, and that's a very revealing change. Loyalty for the part of Nicaragua, Cuba, and Bolivia, very moderately. El Salvador, in the case of Russia and China, their interest really is their investments. The concern of the Russians and the Chinese is the immense debt that the Venezuelan government took, and they just want to get paid. They have contacted the opposition, and there's a certain fluidity, because their only interest really would be maybe a little bit political, but the more significant interest that they have is to get paid. Now, regarding what the opposition would do regarding the Constituent Assembly, I mean, there are no candidates, so therefore there's no possibility to vote. There isn't the intention to boycott. It will stop people from voting. But for people to abstain, it's just how they voted massively at the last Sunday's referendum. You can see that people will abstain, and the government will try to mask that election. And we could have, as a result, that 10 million people voted, but the press, electoral centers, and the social networks will show that that is a lie. So how far is the government willing to go? Well, usually what happens with corrupt states and with criminals, criminals usually know that they will not end up well. We could have established mechanisms of as transitional government, but many sectors of the government know that they don't have much support in the world. They have been sanctioned already by the United States, and that puts them in a very uncomfortable situation to be able to live anywhere outside of Venezuela. Trials are pending, and in the court of La Haye, I'm sorry. So I know that the negotiation is not to see how the government will remain, but how they will exit. And I think that these negotiations are taking place. And we need to tell them, you have the possibility to leave or maybe to remain in some way, but the important is for you to leave government.
The issue of Cuba. Obviously, Cuba has influence in Venezuela. I think an argument can be made to the Cubans that if the government were to collapse and if there were a sudden transition to an opposition-led government, that Cuba would arguably be the country that would most lose out. They would obviously lose an ally, and they would lose the petroleum assistance that they are getting now and other economic benefits. And that much better off for Cuba to join other countries in trying to promote some sort of a peaceful transition and possibly try to reach some sort of accommodation with a new government with regard to a different kind of relationship. I believe, I could be mistaken, I think the opposition would be open to talking to the Cuban government. Again, opposition is many people. I think some of the opposition might be willing to speak to the Cuban government. I don't know what the position of the Cubans would be at this point, but I think that there is an incentive for them to participate in a regional effort, and that's clearly why President Santos was there.
I think that questions have been answered. I don't know if you would like to have other people ask other questions, or?
And I thank everybody here.